Zadie Knight stood rigid at the altar of Dry Creek's only church, her silence a fortress no one could breach, not even the man awaiting her vows beside her. The whispers grew louder with each passing moment of her muteness, cutting through the June air of 1873 like a knife. But something in her eyes, something wild and desperate, kept even the boldest townsfolk from demanding she speak the words that would bind her to a man she did not love. The rustling of silk and the creak of wooden pews punctuated the uncomfortable silence as Zadie stared straight ahead, her knuckles white against the small bouquet of prairie wildflowers clutched in her trembling hands. The pastor cleared his throat for the third time, his patience visibly waning as he exchanged nervous glances with Harold Welch, the banker who stood expectantly at Zadie's side. "Miss Knight," the pastor prompted again, "do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Zadie's lips remained pressed together, her jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched visibly along its line. The church doors remained open to combat the summer heat, and through them, dust motes danced in the golden afternoon light alongside the distant sound of horses and wagon wheels from Dry Creek's Main Street. Harold shifted uncomfortably, his round face flushing deep crimson beneath his meticulously groomed mustache. "She's just nervous," he assured the pastor, though his voice lacked conviction. From the third row of pews, a small movement caught Zadie's eye. A little girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old with golden braids and a calico dress, slipped from her father's side and began making her way toward the altar. The girl's father, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes, reached out to stop her but was too late. The congregation fell into an even deeper silence as the child approached Zadie, looking up at her with innocent curiosity. Without hesitation, the little girl stood on her tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to Zadie's cheek. "Don't be scared, Miss Knight," the child whispered. "My papa says sometimes being brave means listening to your heart, even when it's scary." Something in Zadie's expression cracked. A single tear traced its way down her cheek as she looked down at the child, then up at the man who had risen from his seat, the girl's father, whom she recognized as Kieran Prescott, the owner of the small ranch outside of town. "I cannot," Zadie said, her voice barely audible at first, then gaining strength. "I cannot and will not marry this man." The church erupted in gasps and exclamations as Zadie handed her bouquet to the little girl and gathered her skirts. With a defiant lift of her chin, she strode down the aisle, past the shocked faces of townsfolk who had come to witness what they thought would be a joyous occasion. As she reached the doors, her eyes met Kieran Prescott's. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Then Zadie was gone, leaving nothing but the lingering scent of lavender water and the sound of her boots on the wooden steps of the church. Kieran watched her go, his daughter's small hand clutching his, and felt something stir within him that had lain dormant since his wife had passed 3 years ago. Something like hope. 3 days later, Kieran found himself guiding his wagon along the rutted road leading to the Knight homestead. His daughter, Emma, sat beside him, her legs swinging beneath her Sunday dress. "Why are we visiting Miss Knight, Papa?" Emma asked, clutching a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. Kieran adjusted his hat against the bright morning sun. "Because it's the neighborly thing to do, sweetheart. Miss Knight might need some friends right now." The truth was more complicated. Since the wedding that wasn't, Zadie Knight had become the subject of relentless gossip in Dry Creek. Harold Welch had not taken the public rejection well, and as the town's only banker, he held considerable influence. Kieran had overheard enough at the general store to know that Zadie's reputation was being dragged through the mud, and that the small seamstress shop she operated might soon lose customers. The Knight homestead appeared on the horizon, a modest cabin with a barn and corral set against the backdrop of rolling prairie. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was home. As Kieran drew the wagon to a stop, the front door opened and Zadie emerged, a shotgun held cautiously at her side. When she recognized her visitors, surprise flitted across her features, quickly replaced by wariness. "Mr. Prescott," she acknowledged with a stiff nod. "Emma." "Miss Knight," Kieran removed his hat. "We've brought you something, a peace offering of sorts, though we've no quarrel with you." Emma hopped down from the wagon, her small boots raising puffs of dust as she approached Zadie with the wrapped bundle. "These are apple tarts. I helped make them," she announced proudly. Zadie's expression softened as she set the shotgun aside and accepted the gift. "Thank you, Emma. That's very kind." "We thought you might appreciate some company," Kieran said, remaining by the wagon, "but we won't impose if you'd prefer to be alone." Zadie hesitated, studying him with eyes the color of a summer storm. Her honey-brown hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and she wore a plain work dress rather than the elaborate wedding gown he'd last seen her in. Somehow, she looked more herself this way, more authentic. "I've just put on a pot of coffee," she said finally. "You're welcome to come in, though I should warn you associating with me might not do your reputation any favors in town." Kieran chuckled, retrieving a sack of flour from the wagon bed. "I've never much cared for what folks in town think." "Brought this for you, too. Heard the general store might be reluctant to extend credit these days." A flash of pride crossed Zadie's face, quickly tempered by gratitude. "You didn't have to do that. I know." Their eyes met again, and that same unspoken understanding passed between them. Inside the cabin, Zadie poured coffee into 3 cups, adding milk and a spoonful of precious sugar to Emma's. The interior was humble but meticulously kept, with hand-sewn curtains framing the windows and a patchwork quilt draped over the back of a rocking chair. "Your home is lovely," Kieran remarked, accepting the steaming cup. "It's my parents' home," Zadie corrected. "They've gone to visit my aunt in Kansas City. They don't know yet about." She trailed off, her gaze drifting to the window. "The wedding that wasn't," Kieran supplied gently. Zadie nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "They'll be disappointed. My father arranged the match with Harold. They thought a banker would provide security. And you didn't agree. I tried to convince myself I did." Her voice grew quiet. "Until I was standing there and I couldn't speak the words. Couldn't make myself promise forever to a man who—" She glanced at Emma, who was happily nibbling on one of the tarts, and left the rest unsaid. Kieran understood. Harold Welch had a reputation for his temper, though he kept it carefully hidden beneath a veneer of respectability. "You were brave," he said simply. Zadie looked up, surprised. "Most would call it foolish, or worse." "Most haven't looked into Harold Welch's eyes when a loan payment is late," Kieran replied. "I have." A moment of silence passed between them, filled with unspoken understanding. "Why did you come here today, Mr. Prescott?" Zadie asked finally. "Kieran, please." He set down his cup. "And I came because Emma wanted to see you. She's been talking about you non-stop since the church." Emma looked up at the mention of her name, her face smeared with apple filling. "You looked like a princess in your dress," she told Zadie, "but sad." "Princesses shouldn't be sad when they get married." Zadie's expression softened as she reached out to wipe Emma's cheek with a napkin. "You're right about that, Emma." "And," Kieran continued, "I came because I know what it's like to face this town alone. After my wife died, there were plenty who had opinions about how I should raise Emma or run my ranch. I thought you might appreciate knowing not everyone in Dry Creek is against you." Gratitude flickered in Zadie's eyes, along with something else, a vulnerability that made Kieran want to promise her things would get better, though he had no right to make such assurances. "Thank you," she said simply. "It means more than you know." When they left an hour later, Kieran felt a curious reluctance to go. There was something about Zadie Knight, her quiet strength, the way she'd listened intently as Emma chattered about her dolls, the flash of humor that occasionally broke through her reserve that drew him like a moth to flame. "Can we visit Miss Knight again, Papa?" Emma asked as they headed back toward their ranch. Kieran looked back at the diminishing figure of Zadie standing in her doorway. "Yes," he said. "I think we should." Over the next few weeks, a tentative friendship formed between Kieran, Emma, and Zadie. The visits became regular, sometimes at the Knight homestead, sometimes at the Prescott ranch. Zadie taught Emma to sew doll clothes, and Kieran found himself looking forward to the sound of their laughter. It was during one such visit in late July that Zadie arrived at the ranch looking troubled, her usually neat appearance somewhat disheveled from a hard ride. "Harold's called in my father's loan," she said without preamble as Kieran met her at the corral. "The full amount, due in 30 days. Kieran's jaw tightened. "He can't do that. Your father's been making regular payments. There's a clause. If the bank deems the borrower's circumstances unstable, they can demand immediate repayment." Zadie's laugh was bitter. "Apparently, having a daughter who jilts the banker at the altar qualifies as unstable." "How much?" Kieran asked, already calculating what he could spare. Zadie named a sum that made his heart sink. It was more than he could easily part with, especially with the uncertain cattle prices this season. "We'll lose the homestead," Zadie said quietly. "Everything my parents have worked for all these years." Kieran placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension coiled there. "We'll figure something out, Zadie, I promise." She looked up at him, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Why are you helping me? You barely know me." The question caught him off guard. Why was he so invested in Zadie Knight's problems? The answer came to him with surprising clarity because in the short time he'd known her, she'd brought light back into his and Emma's life. Because the thought of her in distress made his chest ache in ways he'd forgotten it could. "I know enough," he said finally. "I know you're kind to my daughter. I know you work harder than anyone I've met. I know you had the courage to walk away from a marriage that would have broken you." Zadie's breath caught, and for a moment, Kieran thought she might cry. Instead, she straightened her shoulders. "Then we'd better get to work. I've been thinking about ways to raise the money." They spent the afternoon strategizing. Zadie could sell some of her father's livestock, but it wouldn't be enough. Kieran offered what he could spare, but they both knew it was only a fraction of what was needed. As the sun began to set, Emma joined them on the porch with lemonade and more of the apple tarts that had become something of a tradition. "What about a dance?" Emma suggested innocently. "When the church needs money, they have a dance and everyone pays to come." Kieran and Zadie exchanged looks. "That's not a bad idea," Kieran said slowly. "Not a church dance, but maybe something similar." "A community fair," Zadie suggested, enthusiasm growing in her voice. "With auctions and food and games. We could hold it on neutral ground, maybe the meadow by the creek. And I could organize the ranchers to donate stock for auction," Kieran added, his mind racing ahead. "If we can get enough of the townspeople involved, Harold would have a hard time opposing it without looking petty." For the first time that day, hope bloomed in Zadie's eyes. "It could work," she said. "It really could." As they refined the plan, Kieran found himself watching Zadie, the way her hands moved animatedly as she spoke, the determined set of her jaw, the occasional smile that transformed her entire face. He realized with a jolt that he was falling for her, this woman who had crashed into his life less than a month ago. The realization should have frightened him. Since losing Emma's mother, he'd carefully guarded his heart, focusing all his energy on raising his daughter and keeping their ranch afloat. Yet somehow, Zadie had slipped past his defenses, bringing with her a chance at something he'd thought forever lost. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Zadie threw herself into organizing the fair with the same determination she applied to everything. She sewed banners, baked pies, and rode from homestead to homestead, soliciting donations and participation. Kieran, meanwhile, leveraged his good standing with the other ranchers to secure promises of livestock and assistance. Not everyone was supportive. Harold Welch made his displeasure known, suggesting to anyone who would listen that participating in the fair would be tantamount to endorsing Zadie's shameful behavior. Some townsfolk sided with him, but others, particularly those who had dealt with Harold's less charitable business practices, quietly pledged their support. The day before the fair, Kieran found Zadie alone in the meadow, supervising the construction of booths and a makeshift dance floor. Her hair was coming loose from its braid, and smudges of dirt marked her cheeks, but to Kieran, she had never looked more beautiful. "You think it will be enough?" she asked without turning, somehow sensing his presence. Kieran moved to stand beside her. "I think we've done everything we can. The rest is up to fate and the generosity of our neighbors." Zadie nodded, then surprised him by reaching for his hand. "Thank you, Kieran, not just for this, but for believing in me when no one else did." He squeezed her fingers gently. "That's not so hard to do." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Kieran thought she might step closer. Instead, a wagon rumbled into the meadow, breaking the spell. Zadie dropped his hand and moved to greet the newcomers, leaving Kieran with the lingering warmth of her touch and a heart full of unspoken words. The day of the fair dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for an outdoor gathering. By mid-morning, the meadow was transformed into a bustling hub of activity. Colorful banners fluttered in the breeze, the smell of barbecue and baked goods filled the air, and the sound of a fiddle drew people toward the dance floor. To Kieran's relief and Zadie's visible emotion, the turnout exceeded their expectations. Families from town mingled with ranchers and homesteaders. Children darted between booths playing games for penny prizes, and the auction lots drew serious attention from potential buyers. Emma stuck close to Zadie throughout the morning, proudly wearing a special apron Zadie had sewn for her. The sight of them together, his daughter, and the woman who was becoming increasingly important to him, filled Kieran with a contentment he hadn't felt in years. The auction was scheduled for early afternoon. As Kieran prepared to take on the role of auctioneer, he spotted Harold Welch at the edge of the crowd, his expression thunderous. The banker's presence sent a ripple of tension through the gathering, but Kieran refused to be intimidated. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, commanding attention. "Today, we're gathered not just for entertainment, but to support one of our own. The Knight family has been part of this community for 15 years, working the land and contributing to the prosperity we all enjoy." He paused, scanning the faces before him. "Times get hard for all of us at one point or another. Today is about showing what kind of community Dry Creek really is, one that stands together when one of our own needs help." A murmur of approval ran through the crowd, and Kieran launched into the auction with renewed confidence. The bidding was spirited, with several items going for far more than their actual value. Kieran kept a running tally in his head, hope growing with each successful sale. Midway through the proceedings, Harold pushed his way to the front. "This is a farce," he announced loudly. "You're all being taken in by a woman who made a mockery of sacred vows and thinks she can charm her way out of the consequences." A hush fell over the gathering. Kieran tensed, preparing to intervene, but before he could speak, another voice rang out. "That's not true, Mr. Welch, and you know it." All heads turned to see Zadie standing tall, Emma's hand clutched in hers. "I never spoke those vows because I could not promise what I did not feel. Would you have preferred I lie before God and this community?" Harold's face flushed with anger. "You agreed to the match. Your father and I had an understanding. An understanding that didn't include my heart," Zadie replied, her voice steady despite the tremor Kieran could see in her hands. "I apologize for the public nature of my refusal, but I will not apologize for following my conscience." From the crowd, an older woman stepped forward, Mrs. Henderson, the milliner whose shop neighbored Zadie's seamstress business. "I've known Zadie Knight since she was a girl," she said firmly. "She's honest, hardworking, and kind. If she couldn't speak those vows, there was good reason." Others began to voice their support, ranchers who praised the Knight family's integrity, mothers whose daughters Zadie had taught to sew, even the pastor's wife who admitted quietly that perhaps some matches were not meant to be blessed. Faced with this unexpected show of community support, Harold's bluster began to fade. "The loan terms are clear," he insisted, though with less conviction. "Business is business." "Indeed it is," came a new voice. Thomas Fleming, the regional bank inspector who had arrived from Denver the previous day, made his way through the crowd. "Which is why I'm quite interested in reviewing the terms of this particular loan, Mr. Welch. Calling in a performing loan based on personal grievances raises certain regulatory concerns." Harold paled visibly. "I was simply enforcing standard clauses. Perhaps we could discuss those clauses in private," Fleming suggested, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a suggestion. "After the fair, of course. I wouldn't want to interrupt such a fine community event." With as much dignity as he could muster, Harold retreated, followed at a discreet distance by the bank inspector. A collective sigh of relief passed through the crowd, followed by scattered applause that quickly grew into a full-throated cheer. Kieran made his way to Zadie's side, finding her trembling slightly despite her composed expression. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, blinking back tears. "I never expected them to stand up for me like that." "I did," Kieran said simply. "People recognize genuine goodness, Zadie. They just sometimes need a reminder." The auction resumed with renewed enthusiasm, and by the time the sun began to set, they had raised nearly the full amount needed to pay off the loan. As lanterns were lit around the dance floor and the fiddle player struck up a lively tune, a sense of accomplishment and celebration pervaded the meadow. Kieran found Zadie sitting on a hay bale at the edge of the festivities, watching as Emma danced with one of the rancher's sons, both children laughing as they attempted to follow the steps. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the space beside her. Zadie smiled and moved over. "It worked, Kieran." "I can hardly believe it." "I'm not surprised," he said, settling beside her. "You have a way of making people want to help you, Zadie Knight." She turned to look at him, her face softened by the golden lantern light. "Including you, especially me." The words came out more fervently than he'd intended. Something shifted in Zadie's expression, a recognition, perhaps, of what had been growing between them these past weeks. "When I couldn't speak those vows to Harold," she said softly, "it wasn't just because I didn't love him. It was because even then, standing at that altar, I felt something was waiting for me, something better." Kieran's heart hammered against his ribs. "And now I know what it was." She reached out, her fingers gently brushing his. "Who it was." The fiddle transitioned to a slower melody, and from across the dance floor, Emma caught sight of them and waved enthusiastically. "Would you care to dance, Miss Knight?" Kieran asked, standing and offering his hand. Zadie placed her hand in his, her touch sending warmth up his arm and straight to his heart. "I would love to, Mr. Prescott." As they moved onto the dance floor, Kieran pulled her gently into his arms, closer than propriety might strictly allow but not close enough to cause scandal. They swayed to the music, their bodies finding a natural rhythm together. "I never thought I'd find this again," Kieran admitted quietly, his lips close to her ear. "After Emma's mother died, I thought that part of my life was over." Zadie's hand tightened on his shoulder. "And I never thought I'd find it at all, not real love." The word hung between them, neither taking it back nor elaborating further. It was too soon, perhaps, but also undeniable. As the dance ended, Emma darted over to them, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Dance with me too, Papa," she demanded, tugging at his hand. Kieran laughed and swept his daughter up into his arms. "Your wish is my command, Princess Emma." Over Emma's head, his eyes met Zadie's, and the look they exchanged held promises for the future promises neither had expected to make again or for the first time. 1 year later, the church in Dry Creek was once again filled with townsfolk gathered for a wedding. This time, however, the bride wore a simple gown of cream-colored silk that she had sewn herself, adorned with delicate embroidery that had taken months to complete. Zadie stood at the altar beside Kieran, her hands steady in his as they exchanged vows. When the pastor asked if she took this man to be her husband, her voice rang out clear and certain. "I do." As they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, Zadie knelt down to Emma's level. The little girl, now 7, stood proudly in a dress that matched Zadie's, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Thank you," Zadie whispered, "for helping me find my voice that day." Emma beamed and leaned forward to place a soft kiss on Zadie's cheek, an echo of the gesture that had changed all their lives a year before. "I knew you were supposed to be my mama," she said with a child's simple certainty. Kieran helped Zadie to her feet, his eyes shining with love as he looked at his wife and daughter. Together, they walked down the aisle and out into the bright future that awaited them, a future built on courage, kindness, and the love that had bloomed in the aftermath of the wedding where the bride refused to speak. At the door of the church, Zadie paused to look back at the altar where she had once stood in silence and fear. Now, with Kieran's hand warm in hers and Emma skipping ahead, she offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the courage to remain silent when it mattered, and the strength to speak when it mattered more. Outside, the sun shone brilliantly over Dry Creek, and in the distance, the rolling prairie stretched toward the horizon wide open with possibility, just like their hearts.